Yes, Linda, we can hear you. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna start. Okay, welcome everyone. It is Wednesday, September 22nd at 6:30. This is a regularly scheduled select board meeting. My name is Roger Arnold. I am here in Tracy Hall with CATV, and I'm joined by board members Mary Layton, Claudette Brochu, Marcia Calloway, and Robert Gear remotely, and also Rod Francis, interim town manager, is also joining us remotely as well. I think the first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda, and I have one change that I would like to make before I ask for a motion, which is number 4. It says it's an update on hiring. It says an interim town manager and a permanent town manager. I would like to move the update on the hiring of the interim town manager right after the break. That will become the new number 8. I think it's a longer conversation, and I will make a motion for executive session for that update. Okay. So, if the board agrees, can I get a motion for the approval of the agenda with the update on the hiring of the intern town manager being a standalone agenda item for after the break? Go ahead, Claudette. Okay. Is there a second? Okay, made by Claudette, seconded by Marcia. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Mary, you're on mute, just so you know. I don't know if you were trying to speak, but just so you know. Yep. Okay, next on the agenda is public and select board comment. Are there any members of the public who would like to make a comment on the agenda? Okay, are there any select board comments? Go ahead, Claudette. Marcia? So, so go ahead, Claudette. I'm sorry to interrupt you. So I will say that the annual business meeting, which I believe takes place as part of the fair, is on our agenda. It asks us to appoint a delegate, where we're in part, we were in part to inform them of our delegate about 3 days ago. Rod, is it correct that the annual business meeting is part of the town fair, or are these two separate things? Just for So would it be appropriate then to discuss our participation in the town fair as part of the agenda item of number 11? Would board members be okay with that? Yeah. So far,
Yes.
Sounds like I'm only hearing that Claudette has expressed an interest. I might be interested. I have to check with my schedule. Yeah. Right. We don't have a formal process for discussing how to take advantage of professional training opportunities, including VLCT's opportunities, in part because it's not really budgeted. But I'm sure there's a larger conversation we can have on maybe to the spirit of what I think your question is, why we don't review these as a working order, right? Okay. So, so we'll revisit this, but thank you, Claudette, for that comment. Any other select board comments? Okay. Marcia, I hate to do this because we have a packed agenda, but in like 1 minute, do you want to report on the town resource fair and how that was? Yes. Great. Thank you both for being there. Okay, so let's move on then. The consent agenda. So our practice when we make a motion for the consent agenda, we receive correspondence, we approve the AP warrants, and accept the draft meeting minutes as final meeting minutes. And it has been a substantial conversation to pull that separately. But if there is nominal or questions, we can take that up as part of the consent agenda motion. Okay. So there. Is there, go ahead, Claudette. Okay, is there a second? Okay, seconded by Rob. Okay, any discussion of the correspondence, AP warrants, or the meeting minutes? Go ahead, Marcia.
Fund overpayment to Woodsville Guarantee Savings.
Yes, we have an answer for that. Would you like to hear from Fielding? He's here. Would that be appropriate?
That would be nice. Hello, Fielding.
Hi, Marcia. How's it going? So the refund of the overpayments, as some of you might be aware, interest rates have really kind of nosedived over the last year or so. And so we've seen a lot of refinance and mortgage activity as people, plus with a lot of, decent sales as people move into the community. With that, there's often some crossing of wires, I guess, in terms of paying tax payments through escrow accounts. In this case, to Woodsville Guarantee, it was, I believe, during a refi process, there was a slight overpayment, so we are refunding that money back to Woodsville Guarantee and the mortgage holder.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Claudette.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out I had some questions about the AP warrant that were answered in the various emails between myself, Rod, Roger, and Fielding. And Fielding, apologies for not spelling your name right in the email, which is why it got bounced back to me. And I, the answers were appropriate. So I have no other questions.
Thank you, Claudette, for your questions. Okay, any other matters for this consent agenda? Otherwise, I'll call the question. All in favor of approving the consent agenda, please raise your hand. Okay, unanimous, thank you. All right, okay, so I can provide an update on hiring for the permanent town manager. So I think we are at this point in week 2 of our recruitment services arrangement with the Vermont, with VLCT. I spoke to their consultant, Rick McGuire, just a little bit about the process and what to expect in the short term, right? And so, I hesitate to say too much because we'll get an actual calendar with some that will reveal a little bit of the process linked to a schedule, and we'll also be receiving sort of suggestions for advertising. So the calendar for the process and the suggestions for advertising are essentially the first deliverable in this process, and we should be getting that by the end of this week. And then that will be something, there'll be some decision points within that document, right? So what I will say is he asked for our personnel policies, our job description, an explanation of our fringe benefits, all of these documents I was happy to coordinate with him on. And then he, in terms of process, he let me know that there would likely be a committee for a first round of interviews, and there will be a second committee that could be slightly larger for another round, a second round of interviews. And that in that second round may also include some staff as well. The only thing that might be significant to note, given some recent emails about a desire to have a meeting to ask citizens what it is that they are looking for in a town manager, and in light of some other correspondence, I will say that I highlighted to him that public input, sort of above and beyond maybe the norm or expected level of input would be desired. I had suggested, is there a way where you could have a 3-question survey or an email address where folks could send possible interview questions of the candidate? All of that was a little bit beyond scope, but he nonetheless saw the virtue in it, right? And will check with his boss, right? And see where some of those, some meaningful suggestions for public input beyond having some members of the community sit on a committee where that should lie. The one thing that I will say is he underscored to me that while you should have some folks from the community a part of either the first committee or the second committee, this is ultimately a board decision. And he said this more in the spirit of, really owning your responsibility, right, as a hiring entity. And he had alluded to having a schedule that would have every board member meeting the person who would eventually become our town manager. Every board member will have met him or interviewed him twice.
Or her.
Or her. Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Or him or her. Absolutely. Thank you. Them, quite frankly, them. We shouldn't assume them.
Yeah, them.
Yes. Okay. So, any questions on those broad strokes that I have outlined? Go ahead, Marcia.
Can we just have a final draft of the job description? Because we had talked about that and made some changes, and I just wanted to see where it landed, and particularly the qualifications.
Right. So I will say, thank you, Marcia. So he had sent me, so he had been using an older version when we had spoken. I am due to update him with the most recent job description. But he said the job I had asked, what if we might want to make some changes to the job description, more substantially, and the job description was sufficient for his purposes of recruitment, is what I was told. But I will absolutely make sure that he has the most recent one. Yep.
Can we see it again too, the final, because there were some updates?
Yes, and when I say that, I'll make sure he has the latest. That means I haven't sent him the latest yet because those things crossed. But thank you for your attention to it, and so you will see it too. You'll both see it contemporaneously. Any other questions? Unfortunately, I think we won't have sort of the deliverable quite yet. It'll arrive at the end of this week, which is the end of week 2, and we can perhaps have more to sink our teeth into. But otherwise, it was a conversation, and it inspired confidence. Inspired confidence. One of the things I'll keep talking, which which I'm going to stop doing. But one of the things I thought intriguing was, when you have a committee, you want the committee's recommendations to be a committee recommendation, or do you want it to be? Do you want to sort of poll the individual members of the committee? And one of these things I had offered is we often. It is my belief that we often like to hear from a minority view as well as a majority view, and that should be reflected in the committee's recommendations to the board. So all of those nuances will be presented to us in final form, but I believe I appropriately steered him, and we shall see.
Thank you, Roger.
Yeah, so that's all I got.
Can we move on?
I'm happy to move on. How do folks feel about moving on? Good. Okay, Rod, the interim town manager report, an update on significant happenings. You're on mute, so if you unmute yourself and we obviously have the benefit of your report if you want to just speak a little bit to it, and then we can take some questions.
Good evening, everybody. While I just try and find my report in the packet. Or actually, I can do better than that. Hang on a second.
Page 19.
Thank you.
That's helpful,
Yeah.
actually. Thanks, Roger.
Yeah, it is helpful. Okay, so just very quickly, we continue to experience staffing changes, and we're dealing with those as best we can. I believe there's an item later on to talk about arrangements that have been made with a contract to be discussed in executive session potentially later on. So I'd ask that you save questions for then, or if you want to deal with it then, that's okay. Capital budget planning, you'll possibly have questions about this later when that becomes its own item on the agenda, but we've received draft capital budgets for FY 2023 from all the departments that actually have capital. The one thing we don't have, which I think I should flag here, given my role as acting town manager, is we don't have anything substantive about Tracy Hall and what, if any, capital items or projects that would bring forward. I would flag there, mostly just from overhearing, usually actually words that shouldn't be repeated in public. The generator at Tracy Hall is probably an item that needs to be discussed at some point. And so, and obviously the Article 36 task group and whatever happens to Tracy Hall in the medium to long term are potentially capital budget items of interest. So Fielding and I and Masaki have been working on the Public Works capital budget, which, as you might imagine, is predominantly a question of the management of the fleet, the Public Works fleet. And we hope to have material together for you on that soon. That's, so I think, given our circumstances and given where we're at, it'd be good to get a direction from the board as to how you'd like to go about handling the capital budget discussion as a board, and what in particular you're looking for, and what you think would help you in your role as select board. The Milk Fry Nature Area, a group of parents in association or in conjunction with the school, have devised a very small path about 60 or 70 feet in length, and submitted a zoning permit application as an interim measure that will necessitate a development review board hearing, which has been warned as of today for October the 7th, which is the first available DOB meeting time in October. I don't want to necessarily get into the details unless people actually have questions, but this is not to be confused with a longer term project of a larger ABA compliant trail on the Norwich nature area, commonly referred to as the Milfry nature area. Apparently there's a dispute, or at least differences of opinion as to what it's actually called. And so I have been providing town council with documentation in support of a draft agreement, reciprocal licensing agreement, and I actually have a draft of that agreement which I need to review before the next step. So that's ongoing. Then the last thing on my report is that Fielding actually attended a day-long training, again from VLCT, which touched on successful strategies for budgeting and also ARPA funding. He and I have reviewed the latest ARPA funding guidance. I think I wanted to just break out the 4 key categories here. You might note number 1 is very narrow and immediate with regard to the impacts of COVID-19. I'm not sure whether Norwich has data to support making projects that respond to that item, or for that matter, number 2, although we do have emergency workers that could be eligible for some consideration there. So I think the biggest item is number 4. And I think that that would also be an important thing for the select board to think about with regard to capital planning. And in this year and in subsequent years, you'll note there that there's 2 key dates. The funds need to be allocated before the end of 2024, and then they need to be spent before the end of 2026. That doesn't necessarily strike people as being that stringent, but I should point out that in my experience, actually getting a viable project up, getting it permitted and designed or whatever you need to do, and then actually getting it completed and closing it out within 2-3 years, actually surprisingly tough. So we're going to need to spend some time looking at that. So any questions or comments I'm happy to take.
So Rod, and maybe a question for Fielding, has it come down on high, perhaps from VLCT or any other entity, what best measures can be applied or best practices can be applied for boards such as ours to begin the conversation with our community around ARPA funding? I think that's definitely an interest of this board, and obviously it intersects with the budget and certainly capital, but there's obviously a huge participatory piece to this once in a generation funding. And so what has been some of the advice in terms of managing these conversations, particularly in our town, where quite frankly we're overdue to revisit capital. We're overdue to revisit capital, and now we have this big sort of layer on top of it, right? So that was a lot of questions, but has anything sort of come through on how to facilitate or manage these conversations?
Fielding's on mute, so let me get a start, and then he can jump off mute and wave his hands if I get it wrong, and talk as well. So in general, I think VLCT, along with other entities, including Two Rivers Regional Planning Commission, are really leaning heavily on guidance from the federal government that emphasizes public participation and establishing, what the community's priorities are, and being very dedicated to the task of discussing what the needs are and the best way to respond to those are. I think that many communities, and Norwich could be one of those, a good place to start is the town plan. Obviously, the town plan was written ignorant of two key facts. One, it was written ignorant of the pending COVID-19 crisis, and then it was certainly written in total ignorance of the ARPA response. So it's got a fairly typical Vermont modest set of expectations and goals around things like upgrading of infrastructure, right? Whereas maybe if you went back into the 1980s or something and we were more accustomed to a regular delivery of federal funds and state funds to do things like that, we might be that plan may be more ambitious, maybe. Right. So I guess what I'm saying there is that the town plan is not a bad basic document to start from, but it might now feel not very imaginative and not very detailed, because it was written in the context of really there isn't a whole lot of money, and there really isn't a whole lot of opportunity to think about somebody else coming along and helping out your infrastructure problems. So that being said, I think that's a good document. I think that the planning department's got a track record with organizing outreach. We certainly should look at ways of engaging the public, not just in an open-ended way, but actually trying to identify themes or areas that we think would be worthwhile. And we should try and fold it into the budget process as early and as effectively as possible. So I'm happy for Fielding to follow up on that if he's got anything else to add.
I think that was a very good synopsis. I think the big item is to, or what they stressed was more so there are those 4 general categories, some of which can be, pretty wide open to interpretation. And so mainly is to kind of keep the community grounded in those 4 categories, and what they stand for versus kind of just Santa's wish list, so to speak. So really kind of controlling that, because there are limitations in terms of what you can spend the money on. I believe the packet did go into a lot of detail further past this town manager report that does answer a lot of specific questions in terms of the technicalities of what they can be used for, and I think would prove very, very useful in terms of guiding those conversations.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay. Any select board questions for Rod's town manager report? And then I see some public hands. Any board members have any other questions or comments? Rod, you had Rod, you had tracked down a donation that came into the finance office. Marcia was made aware by a member of the public whether or not they received their donation. Can you just speak generally to how this was resolved and how the donor will be thanked?
I believe the donor has been thanked. I believe that there was a kind of a problem to the extent that the entity that worked to send the donation on behalf of the donor to the town addressed it to a mailbox so the town has more than one post office box. The town has a main post office box and a recreation department post office box, which gets very rarely used except for advertising material. And it was directed to that one. So it sat there for some days, without anyone realizing it was there. Once it was discovered that that was actually a donation on behalf of a resident, then it was acted on promptly. We've received the funds, and I understand that a note of gratitude has been sent to the local address of the donor. So
Great, and just to be clear, this is a donation that the board had taken action on, right? Already.
yes, that is also correct. It had been recognized already by the board.
But now it's been properly acknowledged, and we
Yep.
will.
That's my understanding. And if anybody's got anything that contradicts that, that's my understanding as it stands now. If that's not correct, I would be very eager to hear that as soon as possible.
Okay, that's lovely. Marcia, go ahead.
My confusion was that when we had the meeting and a donation was discussed, there wasn't any documentation. We didn't know, even when we voted for accepting it, what it was. And then subsequently, but it did sound like it might have come from a particular person. And then subsequently, the call I got was from a separate person. And at that point, I learned that there were probably 2 gifts. So I think we need to know every time what we're being offered, from whom it's being offered, how many of them there are. It's just, it's not a good way to practice.
And thank you, Marcia. And like fielding is our new finance director is listening, right? And so obviously the gift policy that we're set to discuss tonight suggests that there are procedures that are to be developed by the town manager or their designee, right? So we look forward to seeing that enacted and knowing more about that. So thank you so much, Marcia and Rob. Okay, if there's no other public, or if there's no other select board comments on this agenda item, I'll take Pam Smith's public comment. Go ahead, Pam Smith.
Thank you. Pam Smith, 1445 New Boston Road. A couple months ago, I remember reading something about there also being state money that the town could apply for under ARPA. So just wondered if that's something that is in the plan to go after that money as well.
Would you like me to respond, Roger?
Yes, I have an idea, but let's hear from you, Rob.
You should go ahead and then, yeah, sorry.
No, please, I want to hear from you. We want to hear.
I think that there are some state funds, Pam. I think the predominant source is federal funding. There will be opportunities, I believe, for us to match ARPA funds with state funds to ensure that large projects, or in our terms at least, large projects can be undertaken. So I think that the way the state would express it is that you can use ARPA funds to leverage existing state funds. And I know that the allocation of funds to the state has already meant that federally supported programs from the state, such as the, wait for it, the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, are now offering even more advantageous terms than they were before with regard to this local contribution versus state and federal contribution to the total cost of a project. So yeah, the short answer is yes, there are state funds, and yes, we should think about how to actually maximize those.
And I believe that pot of money for the state is being managed or known by from VLCT, I believe, or there's a contact that is they hired someone to manage.
Yes, it. Yes, they've hired the VLCT has hired a former secretary or assistant secretary of DHCD, and she is working with VLCT on making sure that member towns can access ARPA funds successfully and then match them with existing state programs, and her background in the state will help facilitate that. Her last name is escaping me, but it's Katie. So, yeah.
Thank you, Pam Smith, for that question. Anything else, or should we move on? All right, well, thank you, Rod, and thank you, Fielding. Let's go to number 6. So this agenda item sounds heavy, right? So guiding documents on board jurisdiction and limitations. One possible action is that we'll discuss this document that aims in part to provide an accessible resource for the public who are concerned about problems they want addressed by the select board. This agenda item is being spearheaded by Marcia, and I think we're happy to hear from her for an introduction. Do you mind, Marcia?
No, not at all. Thank you. The genesis of the idea for this was simply that there's been so many questions about what the select board can do that I thought it was important that we sort of took a step back and looked at what this creature of statute that we are, a select board, is actually able to do, and how it intersects with other areas of law and statutory sorts of procedures. And so I had promised something that was concise, and the first thing that I wrote was not concise. So then I went back and did a second one. And essentially, just for the board's consideration and potentially use, when people are concerned about why the board isn't acting, I thought this might serve to help. And I know that there's some good questions brought up by, for example, a member of the public who was here, and I don't see him now. But the problem that we run into, I'm not a Vermont licensed attorney, but we can all read the law and we can all look at what things say, and it doesn't always say the same thing to all of us. And sometimes it looks a little bit confusing. So if you look at the powers of the select board, it looks like it's pretty comprehensive. But then when you realize that once you've voted for a town manager, there are for a town manager form of government, there are statutory things that town manager is supposed to do. And where those things are limited, I believe, my understanding as I keep reading about this, is when towns actually vote to have a, Roger, help me, it's not an incorporation, it's a, I can't think of the word at the moment, but.
Do you mean charter?
Thank you, charter. And so if you have a charter, it can limit by description that the town makes about what the town manager would do. And so based on that, the way we stand at the moment, the shorter document that I've called municipal jurisdiction and limitations just roughly sets out, these are the things that the select board may and may not do, and here are the things that the town manager may and may not do. And the larger document attempts to sort of say, you know, there's also a federal government that comes into play with things like the ADA and all sorts of stuff. And there's other state laws. There are other municipal entities, municipal so-called, which include things like school districts. And then there are just, you know, local stuff that has been enacted. So within all of that milieu of things going on, we have some power and some limited power and some no power, and we have to carefully step through every situation. And so if it behooves the board to use this in some way, I offer it for your, you know, review. And if it helps people in the community, that's great.
Thanks, Marcia. Do any board members have any comments on this, or do they find this helpful or effective, or even just a good first step towards the goals that Marcia states? Go ahead, Mary.
I think it's very well done. I think it does outline the duties of the select board and town manager as I've come to understand them. I also think that I almost wish, and maybe this is part of our interest in resilience, that there was also some way to provide reassurance or provide a forum for when people are upset about a certain issue, because that part, and I think it has to do with stress. It has to do with, for instance, parents that have just been through the COVID crisis and they've had to work and have their kids at home and deal with all kinds of things, or people that would just like to walk down the road, take a walk in their road, but it's too dangerous. I mean, I think that there's situations that would move through the kind of statutory and bureaucratic process really at a bit of a glacial speed, but the need is immediate, like the emotional need is immediate. And I don't know if there's some mechanism for dealing with that, but I think it would be helpful.
Thanks, Mary. Any other board members have any comments or feedback for this document? Go ahead, Rob.
Yes. I was a little confused by the quotation of statute. I'm not sure if anybody else was thinking that following descriptions were part of that previous statute, or if it was generally recognized that just that bullet point was statute. I think that could be clarified some.
Yeah, I was trying to keep it as simple as possible. And so where on the municipal jurisdiction document, I have got in light gray next to a phrase, that comes from that phrase comes from that statute. I can certainly quote it, but sometimes people get lost in those kinds of quotes.
Thank you. I'm just concerned that something that might be a summary could be interpreted as statute.
Yeah, we could easily just do the quote.
Good, Claudette. You're on mute.
Yeah, I was trying to hit my unmute button and I flipped off the screen completely. So I appreciate the effort, but since we're looking at this as a document for the public, to be able to understand what the board does, I would really appreciate if any members of the public find this document helpful, or just a bunch of, or not.
Yes, and I see some hands. Let's round out some select board comments, and then we'll take some more public comment, because I think that's an excellent point, Claudette. Any other board members? I mean, the only thing I would say before and then we'll go to public comment is, I think this obviously is like more in Marsha's voice than certainly in my voice, and I'm happy to like have sort of borrow her voice in that voice, and as a board document. I think for me, I'm always thinking about I feel like I'm often really set up for an understanding or a conversation about roles and responsibilities, obligations, Title 24, the limits of power. Robert's Rules of Order is a big book. You can get it at your local library, right? So I feel like I'm very familiar with these procedural and statutory ideas, although I could always stand to see it laid out in a more concise way, as Marsha has done. But I think for me, it's really, what is sort of the culture that we want to promote around like something like budgeting, or anything else that meaningfully impacts, people's lives, right? What is the participatory function for something like a budgeting process, right? What do you have in a budget that is actually discretionary and can, be susceptible to a fully publicly run sort of process, right? What is not really a discretionary, area of the budget, what cannot actually be subject to conversation, what are our duties as a board to fund. So, which is just to say that I would like to see this effectuate or create a process, that we can live by or govern by. And so I think this is just maybe like step one. Like, I'm really curious about participatory budgeting models. I'm really curious about putting forth a budget that represents our obligations and our duties, and then a budget that also, has a public engagement process that's not just, the 3-minute public comment at our meeting. I don't know if that is relevant or to this document. So Claudia, I see your hand, and then I'll take some public.
Yeah, and I agree with Mary that, I guess, and I agree with you that this is truly in Marcia's voice. And I also, in support of Mary's comment about just having a forum, which our public comment does to some degree, for people to just express their feelings and thoughts. And where it gets a little concerning is that when the public does express concerns, thoughts, the intersection of what the board can do independently versus what is the town manager's responsibility gets a little gray. And so I think we need to be a little bit more responsive when we receive public comments, to, as much as we can, address those public comments in open session and decide whether or not we can discuss them or whether they should be agenda items for the future. So this thing, to my mind, the thing that's still outstanding out there is some kind of short-term safety solutions for Beaver Meadow Road. That's still kind of hanging out there. It's been raised by the public on multiple occasions, but it's still kind of just out there. I don't see this document as explaining how we get from their public comment to some potential action item, I guess.
I will say to the specific point that our planning director and effectively our interim town manager has, to the extent that some of those concerns are planning related issues, has reached out, right, for conversation, and I am aware of that, that dialogue, and I'm watching and waiting and eager, right, as someone who assists in the agenda setting process, right? So I'll say that, right? Let's take some public comments. Peter Warner, go ahead.
Hi, Peter Warner, 6 Moore Lane. I was going to say something awfully similar to what Claudette said, and I want to thank her for saying it. You guys are very, very busy. There's a lot of considerably important issues at stake, not just Beaver Meadow, but I appreciate Claudia mentioning it, but also the sewer situation, the school situation. For this to be the bulk of a select board meeting at 7:15, when a lot of us are here listening, I'm not sure how this is moving forward to address important town business, and I would applaud what Claudette had to say about it.
Okay, Marcia, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I was just trying to help people understand the division of power. And I guess the bottom line is that it all comes down to money. The people have to vote the money. And once it's voted, we can spend it. And it's kind of the short version. But I think if people want a working document maybe trash this, but it gets people an idea to start, and maybe the rest of the board can come up with some other ideas that would be useful to people.
Right, and Marcia, I'm not opposed to even adopting this. I think it's just, I think it's the document that this document or any other consensus building document needs to then effectuate a change in processes. And so I think you're talking about money, so therefore the budgeting process has to change in a way that is more participatory and more meaningfully engages the public. And to what extent is it appropriate for a committee or a citizen committee or a town committee to propose capital projects? What is like the meaningful responsibilities that we have, and then what are the ways we do more than just offer an opportunity for public comment? I think this is step one. Like this is maybe like this is the law, right? This is the obligations, and then what comes next is, I guess, my curiosity. So,
Yeah.
Marcia.
Basically, this was not submitted so that people could accept it as policy of the board. It isn't for us to accept. It is what it is. And I just thought people needed to kind of think about that. But I think it's great if it serves as a springboard for people in town to start talking about it.
Sure. Okay, I see some public comments. I think Pam Smith, you were first, and then Andy Shear. Go ahead.
Thank you. Pam Smith, 1445 New Boston Road. I want to thank Marcia for putting this together because I found it extremely helpful and informative. And I think part of the frustration of the Beaver Meadow Sidewalk Group is that the funding process hasn't been thoroughly explained to them how it works. There's $84,000 in the sidewalk fund, or $80,000, and the local share on the project that was proposed is $243,000. So there's a shortage of funds, and that $80,000 wasn't earmarked for new sidewalk; it was earmarked for maintenance. So I think it's good for people to understand how this works and what your limitations are. You need us to authorize a warrant to fund that sidewalk project if it's going to happen. You can't just go to the select board and say, vote for this and make it happen. So, and I think it's good to inform the public of what the real process is so that they don't get as frustrated as I see the members of this group are right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam Smith. Andy Shear, why don't you go next? And people are very diligently saying name and locatable address. Please do that.
Yes, thanks. Eddie Shear, 23 Hazen Street. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for making these comments, even just bringing this up. It has been very confusing, coming from the public side with I think a legitimate question. And so, the work that Marcia's done, the comments of Claudette and Mary, I really do appreciate. And, it's taken conversations with board members, just running into them on the street and being like, hey, trying to get the explanation. And so, and I appreciate your all openness to informing the public about these things. And I think if there is a way that this can be a document that or a process that's like a manual, like a town user manual for presenting projects or something like that, just thinking in terms of that, I think that would be super helpful. Just an example, Roger, we've talked about, the traffic calming is, perhaps maybe that's better taken on through the staff, whereas the sidewalk might be taken on through, a capital budget through the select board. I mean, that's sort of been hard to tease out. I think we got it now, but it's taken a while to sort of get that. And I think that's been some of the frustration, kind of not knowing where to focus one's energy. So anyway, I applaud this and this effort and trying to make that process possible. So thank you, and let's keep going so we can all, have a good, good relationship with the public and the board. So thank you.
And thank you, Andy. And the only thing I will add to that is, when you made that point about how I've talked to you about, processes that should be routed to town staff versus processes that could come before the board. I was saying that, of course, as, one individual, because, we only govern as a body. And I think this group, and I think the boards that I've always known are particularly collaborative. As you said that, Mary and Marcia were nodding a little bit, right? And so I think we shouldn't assume that all individual board members usually agree, right? And so documents like this are also helpful. I think this group generally agrees and works towards consensus, but that surely hasn't been the case in all of its history, right? So more of a reason to have documents. So I'm gonna actually wrap this up. If more people have some comments, please let me know. But I think the question that I want to pose now to this crew is, what next? And what do we do next with this conversation? Or what is a next step for creating accessible resources for engagement, right? Go ahead, Claudette.
I like Andy's term of a manual. I think that would be helpful. So I would almost like to see this document fleshed out with some examples of how funding, how you could use the Beaver Meadow sidewalk as a perfect example for an example of funding and why we can't move forward if we don't have the funding. I would also suggest that there be some clear distinctions between the school and the town. So we are two separate entities. We can't dictate to the school can't dictate to us. And I think examples of that would be good as well.
I think too, go ahead, Mary. Were you going to say something?
Well, just not only the school, but also the fire district, which is a separate municipality. We can't dictate to them either. I also think if such a manual was put together, it might be helpful just to have schematic drawings of all the different entities and pieces and timelines and cycles and so forth. So
I think too, the one thing I'll say, and this could be part of it if we, eventually decide on such document scope, is 70 cents of every tax dollar goes to the education fund, which is not the same as SAU 70, which is not the same as Marion Cross, right? So, I think this, what duty does any governing body have to sort of explain where your public money is going, is a question, right? Like, I think we all know the way that education is funded and, is, people have spoken to sort of all of these issues. And so the extent that, the boards do this around town meeting day, but the extent that it can sort of live on in a manual may be helpful because, your tax dollars go places, right? But maybe not always stay as immediate in Norwich. All right. Any other comments? So it sounds like a manual is like a future work project in this a crazy year, right? So Marcia's eager. Who else is eager to work on something like this? I'm not going to ask for commitments or even say that's like a next step, but I would like to know who else would, and I shouldn't assume that Marcia's into it. Who would want to write something like this or begin this process of it?
I'm game to work with anybody.
I have an interest, but not necessarily the time. But I think in particular, the concept of having a description within such a manual is how the steps that have to be followed, the limitations of each particular district, fleshing them out in a concrete way would definitely be useful. And to the extent that I could assist with that, I would be interested.
I think it might be interesting to, rather than try to take on something as ambitious and quite frankly as ambiguous as something like a manual, it might help to think of some examples. There might some recent examples that have come up as Claudette and Marcia have alluded to, and then diagnose it. I think the first step to understanding any problem or resolution for any problem is just properly diagnosing the problem. So you might want to take this kind of approach on roles and responsibilities and apply it to some situations that have recently come up, to the extent that that's appropriate or we feel comfortable doing. So
Maybe a case study, like a case study. Right.
So, so we talk about like the hiring of a police chief, or, using municipal funds for some examples that could come forward, applying for grants. So I don't know, and that's maybe beyond the scope of this agenda item, but I would like to see maybe some answers to some commonly occurred problems, maybe. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I think it would be worthwhile to draw on Mary's knowledge and pick as examples something that had been successfully resolved.
Yes.
So that, as opposed to postulating solutions for current and ongoing problems.
Great. What do others think of that? Or is it still too vague?
I don't know that I would be able to come up with some stunning success though, Rob.
Well,
And
public safety facility would be one.
well, that's true.
There you go.
Okay.
I mean, it took a long time to get there, but
Yeah.
And Rob, if Rob doesn't have time, I'm happy to work with Marcia on that.
I think Rob was trying to volunteer Mary's institutional knowledge as our longest serving.
Yeah, as opposed to.
Well, I'm willing to be interviewed. How about that? You can call on me for anecdotes. But I also think that, I mean, some of the things like, the Beaver Meadow neighborhood with the need for a sidewalk there, and also the fact that it makes a loop, it sort of also suggests other ways of thinking about sidewalks in general for the town, and the fact that some are owned by the fire district and some are owned by the town. So sidewalks in general it's just got a lot more scope to it than Beaver Meadow in itself, although I think that's a very worthwhile project. So there's that way of looking at it too.
I do think it might be worthwhile, not that we are researchers or academics, right? We're elected officials, but a broad question might be, how did that sidewalk that goes to Huntley get built? That's not too far removed from the past. And then what was the public participation in getting that sidewalk to Huntley Meadow from wherever, right?
True.
And that came up a little bit, I think, in some of the sidewalk project, but to what extent that it's a research question.
Right.
Okay, Andy Shear, and then I see Nathan has his physical hand up, so let's take Andy Shear and then Nathan, and then one more time with board members, and then we'll move on. So I'll take Andy first, Peter, this time. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, is this a board only endeavor? Could you get members of the public to get a group going that might be, certainly some people with knowledge of the Turnpike sidewalk to Huntley Meadow, for example, but it doesn't have to be just board involved. Can it be others? That's one question. And then I thought of just two small examples: the flashing lights, one that failed, one that didn't, and then the $80,000 bridge. Those are like little small things that have come up, and they've certainly sparked a lot of opinions from the town members and on the listserv. But so those would be my two comments. But if there's a way to sort of engage the bigger public in terms of developing this manual, or someone who just sort of has that municipal knowledge of how these things work, that would be helpful if it's beyond the board. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Mary, I'll get to you. I'm going to take some public comments if that's okay. Actually, no, Mary, go ahead. Do you want to make your comment?
Oh,
I saw that you were a little frustrated with me, so go ahead.
No, I'm not frustrated with you at all, Roger. I think you're terrific and doing a great job. I was just thinking that former select board members, I think, for instance, perhaps Steve Flanders, he was very interested in sidewalks at one point and kind of developed a maintenance scheme. You might know how the earlier sidewalks were put in. So, I do think as a town as a whole, we have some resources for putting together a manual or a guide or whatever. So, yeah, I'd be okay with bringing in the community.
Okay, go ahead, Marcia. I'm cutting board members in front of the public right now, which might illuminate Andy Shear's point. But go ahead. Do you want to make your comment, and then I'll get to.
Sure. I think one thing that approach would probably result in something like this project is an example of how not to do it, and this is an example of how it should be done.
Yes. Okay, and then I'll take some public comments, and then I'm gonna ask Rod, who's taking some notes, what he thinks of this as a staffer. So get ready, Rod. And then we'll move on. Go ahead, Nathan.
As a member of the public and somebody who is virtually clueless as to how this process happens, I'm very interested in finding out. And somebody mentioned, I'm not sure who it was, that a flow chart of the process might be helpful. And I could certainly add my name to the list to work with Marcia to help with that part of it. It's pretty fast work, and it's really helpful for me to see things visually. It might help other people too, but I'm actually curious and would like to help out.
Thank you. Peter, go ahead. Peter Orner.
Hi. I'm not sure where to begin, but I just have a question. I have a timeline that outlines the work that our group has done from January 2019 that I wanted to share with the board, that I thought was appropriate at maybe a different agenda point. But since you guys have been talking about sidewalks, and I can give a little bit of history because I've done some of the research on Turnpike, I just want you all to imagine if the Turnpike sidewalk didn't exist. You all would build it. You would build it. It would be a significant safety hazard for kids to get to Huntley Meadow and having no way to get there, right? And so we're talking about closing the loop to make that even safer. But I don't think the town would, and it happened a number of years ago, but with a cooperation between the town and the fire district, and Linda Cook can tell you all about it because I've asked her. So, but it was the fact that people did something, they got together and did something. So my frustration, and I disagree with my good friend Andy, that I don't know that if we didn't need a manual in the past, I'm not sure we need one now, but that's up to you guys. And sure, it would be helpful to hear some of the ideas of the proper channels. But we have been doing things in this town for a number of years, and things have gotten done. What is the problem now that suddenly, when people are putting forward ideas step by step, working with the town manager, talking to the select board, attending meetings, what are we doing wrong exactly? So I have a timeline of all the things that our group has done. For those of you who are newer on the board that may not be aware of it, I'm more than happy to share that now, but I don't want to take the time that you may not have, and I also don't want to do it in appropriate time.
Thank you so much, Peter. And look, you might find that the boards of past and boards of now might have done something that could a point of improvement. It doesn't necessarily have to. I'm surely the point of we wouldn't go through a document or a process for figuring out a public engagement process only to say that the public needs to engage more. That would be a little, or differently, that would be a little disingenuous, right? It's not quite, it's like somewhere between like a root cause analysis, right? And like figuring out like a public engagement process. I think we're still talking, right, about, you know, that, but I certainly wouldn't say that we would go through we wouldn't go through a process only to find ways to implicitly or explicitly chide the public about what they got wrong about engaging with their government. That is not what we want to do.
If I could interrupt just briefly, we had 5 public meetings that the public was invited to discuss this significant safety issue, not a cosmetic issue, with all respect. It's not cosmetic. It's not because we're, you know, yuppies who want our sidewalk. We want a safer place to walk. And people are out there still every day. The last town manager said, you know, if we made Beaver Meadow safer, more people would walk on it. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's a sound public policy. I think we should want more people out there. So we are advocating for a safer Beaver Meadow. And what has been happening all along is we've been stymied on the safety issue and the traffic calm. It started with Herb in 2019, and it continued, frankly, with you all in the inaction that we've seen over the last few months. So we're trying to put forward a plan to make this particular area of town safer, and we're trying to do it in the right way. So I am more than I would love to hear about the ways that we're doing it incorrectly, but we had multiple public meetings and forums to discuss this. The town spent significant thousands of dollars on a study that included federal money. It was $26,000 from the feds, a significant contribution from the town, but that's all at another board. So I have a data points that point to all this so you can be up to speed on what we've already done. But again, Roger, tell me if it's inappropriate to do it now. Sounds like it is.
Yes, and this is that particular project is not on the agenda, but I appreciate your comments as it relates to, you know, this public engagement question, right? So I'm gonna actually, I think we've had a good discussion. I think it's up to our agenda setting to figure out a way to advance these points. I think folks have specifically talked about a specific project that should be a part of our budget conversations. In what form, I can't speak to at this time. Rod, do you have any reflections? I want to put you on the spot a little bit, and then we really should move on. Do you have any reflections in hearing this conversation? Like, you know, what are some room for staff members to engage in, you know, these kinds of conversations? And what is some of the workflow you see from, you know, your offices and the board? Just an easy question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Yeah, I don't want to bog down in examples necessarily. I think what I would observe here is an understandable level of frustration, both on the part of the board and on the part of members of the public, with how do you go from concept or suggestion to reality when the concept or suggestion is a physical project. And I think Marcia hit it on the head really well when she said that when the rubber meets the road around budget questions and allocations, and then what the money gets spent on. I would say in the traditional Vermont small town sense, the town meeting is a really key venue to understand, and many things start in life as an article on the warrant and then go from there. And in the time that I've been in Norwich, which is not that long, there are examples of that. Article 36 comes to mind, right? And so so the community, the voting public, has an opportunity to discuss and contemplate various projects in that very, if you like, formalized and somewhat narrow framework of town meeting. And then after that, typically what you get is a task group or some other small group, or the select board or its nominees working through an identified issue once it's gone through that initial political phase of being identified as a thing that the community wants to respond to, because time and resources get dedicated to it through the town warrant at town meeting.
Okay.
The other part, though, is that Norwich, I think, is characterized by very active participation in a wide range of groups. So the Conservation and the Commission and the Trails Committee comes to mind, the Childcare Committee comes to mind. It's got diffuse and very active range of groups, all frequently identifying areas that could be improved or resources that could be dedicated or allocated, or even existing core town functions such as class 4 roads and trails, or the function of public safety and how that should be funded and how that should be operated, which also take time and energy and resources to think through and to process. And even in this sense, thinking and working through costs money because it takes time to do. And you need to find professionals or find time to get the professionals that you already have on staff to dedicate their time and resources to those kinds of issues. So I get it. I think that these are really good questions that are raised. I think something such as a manual could be helpful. In my experience, Norwich is a little looser about the diffusion of community interests and how they get articulated and how those things get responded to. I think there's really positive things about that. I think there can be potentially difficult things around that when it comes to budgeting and the allocation of staff resources. And then the last cut is whenever a community finds itself in a situation where they want to explore a new large-scale project, and by large scale, you know, a large new sidewalk project or something similar to that would fall into that category. But it could be a childcare center, it could be a recreation center, it could be a number, you know, any number of things. The devil's in the details. The complex interplay between the regulatory framework and the funding framework are definitely things that need to get played out. And some of that can be extremely frustrating and time consuming. And then understandably, everybody shares in that frustration. But I can't remember what it was, but I think that the urge to get a new emergency services building, the police fire building, it was, you know, more than 2 decades between the recognition that it needed to be something to be fixed and then the new building finally being commissioned and opened. So I don't want to disappoint people or dissuade them from actively engaging, but I do want to remind people that with many public projects, it takes enormous amounts of patience and determination. And the more expensive it is and the more governed by regulatory frameworks it is, the more likely that it is to take extra time. And that's what staff are for, to navigate that labyrinth.
Okay, well, thank you, Rod. I think that was a helpful coda, if not, you know, if nothing else. I really appreciate that. I think a lot of board members were nodding. And it's true, I guess I at least have never thought of our passions as diffuse, but you know, indeed they are, right? And our values. Okay, so any other board members want to get a final word before we move on? Okay, so Marsha, I thank you for your concise document, and obviously our conversation was maybe more broad than the document, but nonetheless, I think it was a good conversation. It seems like there's some follow-up and agenda setting for you know, what kind of work we can do to further the guiding documents on board jurisdiction. Right? Okay. So, you know, let's turn to the 2021 winter sand bid. So we're gonna authorize the selection of supplier for the 2021 winter sand. There's less supporting documentation that is the norm for this packet, owing to obviously to some vacancies, but we nonetheless have all the information, or we have some information to share. So why don't we begin with a motion and then discuss things in it. Go ahead, Claudette.
I move to purchase 2021 winter sand from Twin State pursuant to their bid of $12.85 per ton.
Is there a second? Okay, made by Rob, I believe. Is that, Okay, any discussion? So
Yes.
I think there's a couple of things we should ask Rod. So in 2019, looking through my emails, the bids, in 2019, we had the same companies who bid. It was Twin State was $12.70 per ton in 2019. The questions that were answered then is how much sand remains and how much sand can we get for the $12.85 per ton. These are some of the kinds of questions that were asked in the past or answered in the past. Rod, do you have any, do you have a sense of these answers to these questions you were fielding?
I think Fielding might have a better sense of the actual bid documents. My recollection is that they bid on the amount that was requested, and the request also required them to deliver it within a time frame and use their equipment to basically to place it on site. The only other bid we received couldn't make the time limit and didn't have equipment available to place it on site. So they didn't meet the requirements of the bid documents effectively. So we are left with one effective bid.
Okay, Mary, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's come up in the past to ask about the source.
That was for salt, in all
That
fairness.
was for salt. You're right.
Yep.
You're right.
Yeah.
That's salt.
I believe, given the geology of the Upper Valley, this is something that we can be very proud of. It's very local.
It's very local. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. I was getting mixed up
But
between salt.
the salt is Chilean or was Chilean, and you know,
that's right.
that's maybe not so kosher. But yeah, the sand is really local.
And the salt bid will come in too?
Yeah.
Or are we okay on salt?
Yeah, I believe the salt bid is yet to be opened.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the middle of October last year, Mary.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, a question is that purchase our purview? If it's competitive bids, is that not within the realm of the scope of the job of a town manager? Go ahead. Well, pardon me. Yes.
Yeah, it's the size of the bid, and so it's something of a formality, but an important one. You are approving the bid, and so then we can approach Twin States if that's the decision and enter into contract and set it up. But it's the bidding process is the purview of the town manager and the director of public works, but the decision to approve the bid is definitely the select board's purview.
Okay.
And Rod, is that for items over $5,000? Is there a monetary figure attached to that?
Yeah, that's the limit.
That's the purchasing policy.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Was that a moment where I was missing Rob's humor, or I'm not sure.
No. The humor would have been: is it organically sourced?
Okay.
I
almost went there.
it's like an inorganic substance, so
It isn't.
Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll go ahead, Marcia. You're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry, I said it's not green. But
It's
how
beige.
many? It's per ton for both of them. How many tons? Did I miss that?
I can't recall. I don't have the bid document in front of me, and I can't recall. It's probably in the packet.
Let's see it.
Yeah.
So in 2000, so that was one of my questions. So usually, and it's okay that it's different given where we are with staffing, but Larry told us like how much sand is sort of around right now, right? And then how much sand they can purchase with the amount that we have and the price per ton. So that's usually the information he provides.
Correct. So I believe actually, this is one of the things that Larry actually saw too on the way out the door. So it was to achieve the needed amount of sand to be on hand at the beginning of the season. So it was the difference between what was left over and the starting point of where Public Works is with a reliable supply of sand.
So in a bad year, how much sand do we use? I'm just trying to get a ballpark.
Oh,
yeah, go ahead, Claudette. And then I can answer. I have it right here, but go ahead, Claudette.
Yeah, last year, the year before, it varies year to year. It depends on the severity of the winter. There have been years that we've been way over budget, and there have been years that we've been under budget. So, yeah, there's no predicting.
So in a bad year, might we use 20 tons?
I would say we probably use way more, probably more than that in a bad year. But Roger, I think you said you had some specific numbers.
Yes. So one of the issues, or I think frustrations, is sometimes things are delivered or talked about in cubic yards, and there's a conversion that takes place. So last year, in last year, as in like 2018, let's say, it was, I think, a difficult year, and that used 7,800 cubic yards, or approximately 10,000 tons. And then in 2019, it was requested that it was 1,270 a ton, and they used 5,118 tons, and the winter sand budget was budgeted at $65,000. So those are some numbers to fill in. So you're looking, in a bad winter, it looked like it was 10,000 tons.
So we could be talking well over $100,000.
I think I don't know how much is budgeted right now. We have some folks here that might be answer that specifically, but in the past we've budgeted $65,000, and there looks like and it looks like there was about a $10,000 or so overrun once. But I'm not speaking with great fidelity right now, but I can tell you.
So Masha, these are actually really good questions. So Fielding and I will take a look. We'll get a historical sense of. We'll try and go far enough back in the budget and bidding process to sort of establish kind of a 5-year average or something such as that. And we'll let you know. I think the comments from the other select board members speak from experience. It can fluctuate wildly. And then the other factors that happen, if it's a really bad winter and we get towards the end of the supply and we have to get more in, well, of course, everybody else is having a bad winter and it won't be that cheap. But what we, of course, try and do is get enough on board so that we are not buying in an emergency situation. But I've certainly seen towns, have to do that more with salt than sand, I think. But if Fielding's got any background on it right now, I think he's got his hand up, so maybe he can help us out. But I think you're asking great questions, and so we'll get the information for you.
So just the background information that you guys are looking for. The bid that was put out was for 9,000 tons, which is what they submitted on. We have also budgeted $105,000 for this current fiscal year to cover that expenditure.
That helps.
Is that sand and salt, or 105 is the sand budget line alone?
105 is the sand budget alone. Salt we have budgeted for 115,000. That does include chemicals. I would have to defer to the DPW guys though, exactly to what those constitute.
Hi, Marcia. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm sorry. So obviously, this is one of those things. I mean, I've lived well over 60 years in Vermont, and I just know that this isn't fluctuating and it's a necessity. But I just think as a select board member, we have an obligation to know what we're voting for. So it's not that I have any problem with getting it. It's just that I think we have an obligation to put it on record and vote for that.
So I just want to be clear, and I appreciate that, Marcia, but where the motion, what we're voting on is the bid of Twin State of $12.85 per ton, right? So surely what you're speaking to is like a wider context, but one could argue that that wider context was settled in a budget process, right? So I appreciate what you're saying, but I just want to make clear that we're voting on pursuant to a bid, right? And
Yeah, I just think it would be helpful that, you know, Fielding's information was great. So to add that to this information, it sort of sets it in context and it gives us sort of, helps me feel I'm meeting my fiduciary duty.
And that's fine, particularly because you weren't part of our budget process. And so I think that's a fine process suggestion. I just don't, I wish to clarify that of what it is that we're voting on and the information. Yes, okay. All right, I think you get the spirit of what I'm saying. Claudette, go ahead, and then let's really call the question.
No, I just, very quick comment. Last year, we voted to increase that line item because we had been stuck buying emergency sand the year before, and we had cut the budget the previous year. So yeah, but this is a typical, let's call the question. This is just a bid.
Yes, so I'm going to do that. So all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. All right. And then with that, let's take a 10-minute break. Let's come back at 8:11, and then we'll likely have an executive session. But we'll be back at 8:11, okay? Waiting for some board members to come back. Okay, there's Mary, just waiting for Marcia to appear. I'm gonna maybe start in the interest of time. Okay.
Recording in progress.
Okay, I'm resuming the Wednesday, September 22nd meeting at 8:12. Claudette, you had your hand up?
Yeah, Roger, I just, if I may, want to apologize to Marcia. My previous comments sounded quite harsh.
Well, they didn't, but thank you very much. I have very thick skin.
That's wonderful. Okay, thanks both. Okay, so now we added, remember, to the agenda, an update on the hiring of an interim town manager. So I just wanted to summarize quickly, on a September 14th special meeting in public session, we authorized a conditional offer of employment pending a background check, oh gosh, I'm forgetting, I memorized the motion, a background check, a reference check, and then agreement of contract and salary terms, right? And so all of that work, it has been in motion this past week. And so I would like to actually update the board on one of these one aspects of that. I would like to update them on the contract conversations. And so I'll make a finding to go into executive. But before then, I just wanted to say that, the Valley News reported that we made an employment offer to someone of mystery. And I would just like to say that, it is pretty, I would hope that the public understands that in personnel matters, you often, you have to have conversations in executive, and then in order to take any kind of action following your discussions, you have to do so, you have to make a motion in public. And so our motion that we made in public on September 14th just began a process that was conditional to a set of conversations that you would expect in a negotiation or a conversation around employment, around personnel. So I hope that the public trusts that we are working very diligently and quickly on this hire and with this candidate. And that being said, I would now like to move to find that the select board find that premature general public knowledge would clearly place the town at a substantial disadvantage in its contract negotiations with an interim town manager by disclosing the proposed items or terms rather of their employment and compensation before the board has an opportunity to properly consider and then discuss the same. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay. Seconded by Mary. And I can, all in favor, please vote. Please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. And then I move to enter executive session to consider contracts under 1 VSA 3131A. All in favor? Or is there a second?
I'll second that one too.
Thank you, Mary. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. We're now in executive. I'll pause the recording, place some folks in the meeting room, and we'll have our executive session. I anticipate, but don't know, that we'll be out by 8:30. Okay.
Recording.
that the ghost of Tracy Hall?
Yep. We're good? Nope. What have I done? Oh, it's me. It's me. Now we're good, right?
Thank you.
Okay. Hold on.
Recording in progress.
Is there a
Move
motion
to enter public session.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Made by Claudette, seconded by Mary. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. Is there any action we wish to take following that executive session?
I move that we authorize the select board chair to continue the negotiations with our interim town manager candidate.
I second.
Okay. Thank you. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. Thank you. All right. So where is Rod? Here's Rod. Hello, Rod. There is the next item on the agenda is the existing staffing and potential disciplinary action. Board will discuss some personnel issues, including an attorney-client work product. Is there anything that you can say to frame this conversation as appropriate for the public before we take a motion, Rod?
I want to remain careful in my remarks, so I'm going to keep them brief. Prior to my assuming the role of acting town manager, there were concerns expressed by some staff members of Public Works that the previous town manager was aware of, and upon council's advice, I understand that we need to take a formal action so that the working conditions of all members of DPW staff are protected.
Thank you, Rod. And with that, let's can we have a motion?
I move to find that premature general public knowledge about existing potential disciplinary action would clearly place the select board at a substantial disadvantage.
And the town as well, right? The select board and the town.
The select board and the town at a substantial disadvantage.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Made by Mary, seconded by Rob. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Is there a second motion?
Yeah. Pardon?
Is there a second motion?
Yes, there is. A second part to the motion.
Right, thank you, Mary.
I move to enter executive session under 1 VSA, section 313A, 1F, to consider attorney-client communications.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Made by Mary, seconded by Rob. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. With apology to folks who just joined us, I'm going to now pause the recording and move into another executive session with appreciation.
We should amend that to include the acting town manager, the interim town manager to attend. Should we?
We are back in open session, Linda Cook, but we are going to enter another executive session, and we're actually looking to fine tune our motions.
Okay, you
so
never let me in to hear it.
I didn't know you were even here. Last I saw you, you were on your phone on Zoom, so apologies.
I just came up to see if you were out of executive.
Okay, well, we're now in public, and we're figuring out our motion to go back into executive,
Will
okay?
you let me out next time, please?
As soon as I know you're here,
I'm still on the phone.
Okay, yes, you're here in public. I see you.
I only drove up here. All right, so I'm still showing I'm there.
Yes, you're showing as here, and also you're physically there. Linda, I would.
All right, I'll go back and wait till you let me in.
You are in, and I'm going to now get our motion so I can put you back out. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we made the motion to vote, and we now have, I'm understanding we have a friendly amendment to make sure that the attorney-client communications that were made to Rod Francis can be communicated and turned to the board. So can I actually I'm going to actually ask that we vote again on a motion to include that information. How's that? Is that procedurally appropriate?
I think so. I will amend my motion to include the interim town manager in our executive session. And I think
Second.
Rob has to second it, yeah.
Yeah, second.
Okay, great. Now let's vote in that amendment. All in favor, please raise your hand on that amendment. Okay, great. Thank you for that. And while I helped communicate with a member of the public around that. So Linda on the window, Linda on the phone, and all the other members of the public, I'm now going to move you into the waiting room so we can have the executive session, okay? So I'm pausing the recording.
Recording stopped.
Folks can hear me. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I hear. Okay. So is there a motion to enter public session?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. So now we're in public session. Linda Cook, do you know that we're in public session? We wanted to know, and I want to be mindful. Okay, well, we're in public session, folks. Okay, and the next item on the agenda is the short-term replacement of the finance assistant. So board will discuss possible staffing decision in the finance office. And this is possibly another executive session. So to frame this, Rod, can you help by framing this before we take action or before we move into executive?
Yes. So as you know, Fielding joined us a couple of weeks ago now, and not long after Fielding joined us, Becky Grammer, who has been with the town for a total of 3 years, first as a temp employee and then as a direct employee, offered her resignation effective, I believe, September 27th. And so this is a challenge for the town as a whole and finance department in particular, because it foreshortens dramatically the period of one-on-one training that could happen between Becky and Fielding as he acclimates to the town's systems and accounts. So the course of action that we have available to us is to go out and advertise for the position or seek the short-term contract work from a temp agency. And so that would be the basis of the discussion for executive session, to delineate the best approach going forward to ensure the finance department is functional.
And just to be clear, there's a possible applicant to consider, or both an applicant,
yes,
an applicant to consider under the sort of the temp agency structure.
Correct.
That it would be the nature of our conversation. So
correct.
At this point, I would like to take a motion for that.
All right. I move to enter executive session under 1 VSA section 313A3 to discuss the employment of a town employee and to invite the interim town manager and the finance director.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. There's only one part of that motion, so with apologies to the public again for this evening of executive, I'm going to move folks back into the waiting room from the comfort of your own home. Okay, I'm going to push pause now.
Recording stopped.
Okay, is there a motion to enter public session?
So moved.
So
Second.
seconded by Rob. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. So I have an action to take unless other folks would like to do it. I'm happy to do it.
Go ahead, Roger.
Do it. Let's see if I can move my own. Let me see. I move to allow I'm to authorize the interim town manager to negotiate a contract with Robert Half for assistance with the financial assistant position, and to advertise the position as an entity of the town for a future date.
A second.
Okay. Any further discussion on my clunky motion? No. Okay. Then all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. Thank you. So that's great. So I want to take a look a little bit of our agenda here, folks. It's 10:13 at night. I apologize that we're still have a couple of big items here on the agenda. But what I would like to suggest is we discuss number 10 and number 11, and that 12, 13, and 14, 14 being particularly important, we table to a future special meeting, perhaps next week, where we could also potentially have an update on the interim town manager hiring. So
Sounds good to me.
We can agree by consensus to table into a future date item the gift policy, the capital budgeting policy, and the budget calendaring pieces.
Right.
Okay, so we'll say by consensus at 10:14 we agreed to that. How's that? Okay. I'm seeing yes.
Good.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so next is the pay rate for the interim town manager. So we're going to just formalize this pay rate for Rod Francis. It was outlined in his letter of agreement with us, with the town. The amount came from a rationalization provided by Herb Durfee as to historical practice, and I will also say that the rate is comparable to other municipal managers in Vermont as informed by documentation from VLCT. So can I get a motion?
Yes, I move to set the pay rate for interim town manager Rod Francis at $40.67 per hour.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, made by Mary, seconded by Rob. Any further discussion, or can I call the question?
So call it.
Call the question. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Now, the VLCT annual business meeting voting delegate. So, as I said, the deadline for the notice of our delegate to VLCT has passed. This motion will basically look to provide a name at the late notice. So in the past, I will say that Herb served as our delegate, I believe. Let me first begin by saying, is there any member of the board who would be interested in attending and then also serving as our delegate?
Claudette, I thought you were.
Claudette?
No, Claudette was planning on going to the, not the business meeting that's on the 28th or 29th, but to the virtual meetings, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, I think, were the dates. So I was not planning on attending the business meeting.
Okay. Any other, let me just check what day of the week the 28th is.
Wednesday.
Yeah, Wednesday is like the one day that I can't. Any other board members? as the delegate?
I'm working again.
Okay. Rob, do you have, is that interest? Is that your hand for interest?
Sure. Yeah, I have accumulated 7 weeks of vacation, so I could take one to find out more about the business meeting.
Okay. That sounds good to me. Does anyone have any objections on Rob as our delegate?
No.
Thank you, Rob.
So why don't we
You're welcome.
take a motion with Rob's name?
Okay, I move to appoint Rob Gear as Norwich's voting delegate for the VLCT annual business meeting.
Second.
Seconded by Claudette. Any discussion?
Rob, if you're not getting the VLCT updates, just go on their
Yeah, yeah.
website. It's all there.
Yep. Okay, good.
The only thing I will say in terms of the town fair is I'll check my calendar and coordinate with you, Claudette, and then maybe we can figure out whatever savings that might accrue from us both signing up together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it doesn't matter to me. It just, I was gonna just put it on my own personal credit card and then ask for reimbursement. But,
Okay.
however we do it, I don't care.
Okay, that sounds fair. So Rob's going to be the rep and Claudette's attending the town fair, maybe me. Okay, so we have a motion on the table. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, Rob, I don't see your hand. Yes, just vote for yourself. Okay, yes. Okay, great, excellent. Okay, so I'm so thankful for all of you. I think this was a very productive meeting. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to our full agenda. Obviously, we'll schedule a special meeting. You haven't seen the last of us, folks. There'll be another special meeting. So just, okay, I won't do humor at 10:19. So thank you all. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand.
And thank you, Rod and Fielding,
Yes.
for all your
Thank you,
work.
Henry.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Really appreciate it. Take care. See you all.
Good night.
Good night.